All right. Well, welcome everyone to the latest installment of the Contino CloudFest. This is an interesting topic that Jan and I probably have spent quite a bit of time discussing, and even some of that time has been without beers in our hands. So it's something near and dear to our hearts. But it's really just talking about the power of data, right? How many organizations are there out there that have this giant, what has been seen as a liability, just sitting there in storage or on disks, and they just move it. Basically, when you move from house to house and you keep putting stuff in either storage or in your basement, eventually you start looking at it, wondering if there's any value. What we're here to talk about today is how do we actually take these things, additional data sets, and start managing them together to give us some insight to know how we should more efficiently run or scale our business. So hopefully that's something of interest. We're going to talk through quite a few different aspects of this today, and it's not just theory. We're going to talk about practical application. We're going to talk about how this has been used in practice, and we're going to talk about how we as business leaders can start thinking about leveraging data as a core differentiator for our business and how to make better decisions going forward. So moving forward, by way of introduction, my name is Ryan. I am Senior Vice President for Contino, based here in beautiful Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, although it is not sunny in Philadelphia today. I guess you can follow me on any of the social media that you want. I'm a little behind these days, just given the speed and scale that Contino has been growing. But I basically help oversee quite a bit of the solution architecture and the delivery that we do in the North American region. Been with Contino basically as long as we've been operating in North America. So really proud of the team that we've built, the customers we work with, and the solutions that we offer. I'll let my friend Jan introduce himself.
Sure, yeah, my name is Yun Z Lin. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer and Director of Innovation for Contino APAC. So I joined Contino back in 2017 as the VP of Engineering, and I moved into the innovation role to kind of look at how Contino as that sort of cutting edge boutique consultancy working in the DevOps space can move into the other value adding areas for our clients, and also looking at how we can actually help our clients innovate in the areas of data, in the sort of digital innovation, as well as improving the customer experience. An interesting fact, I did meet Ryan on my first day in Contino, and my first day was actually in Vegas, where we were attending the AWS reInvent. I'm based out of Sydney, sunny Sydney, down under in Australia. And yeah, feel free to follow me on either LinkedIn, Mr. Serverless, or at Yunzilin on Twitter.
I think you did that backwards. Your LinkedIn should be your Twitter handle. Your Twitter handle should be your LinkedIn. So about Contino real quickly. Our target customers are usually going to be some of the world's largest enterprises. We specifically focus in that space due to the fact that the problems that they have are at scale, and they have just a large number of systems, people, problems, and honestly, we're attracted towards the compliance and governance constraints that the enterprise has to operate within. And we're going to talk about compliance quite a bit today as we talk about data. Our core focus, from a heritage perspective, has been on DevOps and cloud. We were formed about 6-7 years ago, and during that time, DevOps has taken on its own definition, and under that umbrella, you see things emerge like SRE, site reliability engineering. You see things like data. You see things like AI and ML emerging, right? So as the umbrella of DevOps has broadened, so has Contino's focus into those spaces. Sitting here today, we're at about 400 people globally. We operate out of 5 core offices in 3 regions. There are 2 in North America, 1 in New York, 1 in Atlanta. We have global HQ in London, and we have 2 offices in Yun's home country. We have 1 in Melbourne and 1 in Sydney. We've done this for a number of clients. We have over 500 engagements under our belt. And if you look across a small sampling of the customers that we work with, doesn't matter which region you sit in, you should see some familiar enterprise logos that we operate with. And this just speaks to the capability of our team, the ability for our delivery folks to work with some of the most stalwart brands in the world and deliver, just industry blazing capabilities at speed and scale within those constraints. So moving forward. So there is pretty interesting, again, if you remember the target that Contino aims to satisfy, which is the enterprise, there's a lot of contradictory challenges that face that specific area of business, right? There is a disruption underfoot, right? If you're in financial services, you're seeing things that were once sacred areas of business, such as trading, being disrupted by things like Robinhood, right? If you're in the area of insurance, you're starting to see these startup and mid-markets really gobble up market share in the insurance space. And if you're in healthcare tech and healthcare startups are starting to actually make a significant impact on the marketplace. So how do we balance this disruption and maintain business agility within the confines of a highly regulated enterprise? And how do we make sure that we manage our data-driven customer centricity when historically that's not, like, we're basically inverting the pyramid. We're making the customer the center of the data models versus making the enterprise the center of the data models. And you're gonna, if this were a drinking game, every time we say compliance, you'd be in bad shape by the end of this session. But how do we manage compliance, and how do we manage legacy, both from a technology perspective and from a human perspective, right? We have legacy operating models and legacy learned behaviors that are not necessarily conducive with shifting to a more of a data-driven model. The long pause is the nice way of saying next. So the purpose of the cloud data transformation really is, and I'm sorry for reading, but we're looking to democratize data to basically drive real-time value to the organization while maintaining that compliance and controlled environment, right? So we're trying to allow the enterprise to become more intelligent about their systems, their developers, and their users, and the services for which that they provide. So if this resonates with you, if you're hearing this live, or if you're watching this on a recording, this is what the core of the session will be on today, and we will get into, like I said, some use cases. As we kick this off, just a couple quick reminders. As I said, there will be a recording available. So if you're attending this and you think of a colleague, a peer, a coworker, or just somebody that you know in the industry that may find value in this that was not able to make the live session, I think as early as tomorrow there will be a recording available, assuming Jan and I don't blow this too bad. Secondly, if you have questions as we're going through this, you should have a chat window available. Please just lock your questions in there. If there's time at the end, we're happy to address any and all questions. And if we don't get to it live in the workshop here, feel free to hit us up either on the social media links that we gave in the beginning, or if you want to leave an email in your question. It's obviously only going to be visible to Jan, so we won't be sharing those emails if you're comfortable leaving it. And we'll follow up after the session. So when we think about the framing of democratizing your data to drive real-time value, right? Let's think about the three different questions that we always want to ask ourselves. Why is it that we think that real-time data drives business value? We will get into the why behind the sentiment here. A lot of times, if you're a technologist, welcome my brothers and sisters, but if you're a technologist, we are preconditioned to jump into the solutioning. So the how is almost always the first thing in the front of our brain. How are we going to solve for this problem? But if you notice, the way that we're framing this is we want to agree on the why before we get into the implementation. And ultimately, after the how comes the what. And the way I like to think about the what is the business value. What are we actually extracting from the how to drive something of value for either our users or for our business? So in this case, we're going to be talking about the Transportation Authority for New South Wales. It's a state within Australia. That's the case study that we're going to talk through. And we'll frame this up when we get to that point in the presentation, but we're going to talk about all three of these: why we did it, how we did it, and what value that's actually extracting for the users of the systems. So a lot of art and science is wrapped into this presentation, and we're about to do the deep dive now. So if this does sound interesting, we do have other data-related webinars, as well as some webinars on Kubernetes, on business cases for technology and things of that nature. You can definitely find the links available on Contino.io or on our social media feeds. But there's already recordings available for leveraging machine learning to maximize customer retention and minimize churn, and also virtualizing your contact centers in the cloud. So how can we actually boost consumer experiencing, leveraging data and leveraging the cloud? And with that, I think I turn this over to Jan for a bit.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for the introduction. So as Ryan has highlighted, we're going to dig into the why of data, how it drives, why data drives real-time business value, and then followed up by the how, and then also the what, and then with the case study to wrap everything together. So, you know, in terms of the why, I really like this statement from Marissa Mayer around, well, with data collection, the sooner the better, right? Like you want the data to be as real-time as possible, so that can then drive, in turn, whether it's decisions or recommendations or prescriptions in a semi-real-time fashion as well. So let's actually take a moment and take a step back, as Ryan said. You know, as engineers, as technologists, as sort of business leaders, even a lot of time we jump into the how and the what, right, straight away. But let's reflect on the why. Like, what is this concept? What is business value at the end of the day, right? Is it really about a particular formula? Is it some sort of magic formula? Something that the product owner knows, something that the CEO knows. You know, I've been kind of exploring this sort of concept myself a lot of times when I end up on different engagements, or as far as talking to executives. It's like, what is the value, right? Every organization actually has a different concept of value. You can actually see clues of what the organization values through even sometimes bureaucracy and processes that are legacy, but it actually is a remnant of why they were set in place in the first place, right? Typically, an insurance organization is very risk averse. Therefore, they will set in place compliance controls and sort of risk postures in order to make sure that they guard the data and the privacy of the customers, and to be able to sort of give the customers a very reassuring experience. But over time, over say hundreds of years, this process becomes out of date, and it becomes a matter of actually going back and see how these processes can be modernized, and a lot of compliance controls can be automated so that they can continue to add value. So what happens is we do come to this conclusion that business value is never static, right? It's not something that you do once and you can continue to do that continuously. You always got to reinvent yourself. You got to keep looking ahead of this disruption curve. And really, at the end of the day, business value requires a level of foresight. It's not about just looking at an ROI, return on investment of a particular product or particular initiative at this point in time. It requires you to look into the future and to think about, well, you know, what are the future potential options I can exercise as a business stakeholder, or what are some of the future-looking technologies that I can implement to make my organization better and more relevant as time goes on. And I really like this example of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. For those of you who kind of think about Sydney, you know, the harborside city, you know, sunny weather, sunny beaches, beautiful sort of coastal lines. But back in the day when the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is an iconic landmark now, when they were building it, the business case for the bridge was very much to replace the ferries, so the ships, the boats. that were actually ferrying workers and travelers from the northern side of Sydney to the southern side. So these boats were getting out of date, they were getting very legacy, and there was a business case saying, well, you know, we're going to replace those boats, we might as well build a bridge. And then the business case evolved into, well, if we're going to build a bridge, we might as well collect some tollway. And that was the business case. So nobody had the foresight to actually see that the bridge eventually turned into a landmark, which everybody resonates with when they think about Sydney, and the fact that it connected the north and south side of Australia, Sydney, to make it into a modern metropolis of economic growth, of commercial gains. So a lot of the foresight just simply wasn't there, right? So it's quite interesting. A lot of times when I speak to executives about business cases, I'm saying you only know so much, and there's a level of sort of gut feel, or ideally you want to drive your decision based on data and foresight of what will happen in the future, right? As opposed to just rely on information now. And that kind of makes me come to my next point around, well, to have that sort of level of foresight, to be able to use past data to predict the future, well, you need sort of real-time data. And unfortunately, your typical enterprise organization is what's known as a complex adaptive system, right? It's a CAS. So not only you need sort of real-time data feeding in, you also need the sort of real-time insights and the foresight to be feeding out to the folks on the ground. Typically in an organization, the management as well as the executive, they do not have direct control of the rest of the organization. So it's actually important not only to be feeding the data in real time, but you got to get the commands to your troops out there into the battlefield. And I really like the story of the Battle of Borodino, which is when Napoleon decided to invade Russia. He was actually commanding his troop at the famous Battle of Borodino from a hillside that was 1 mile away. So you can imagine when the troops actually captured a bridge, a messenger had to travel 1 mile to Napoleon and ask him, sir, we have captured the bridge. What would you like us to do? And Napoleon would say, well, cross the bridge and then reform on the other side, and I will join you. When the messenger got back to the troops, the bridge was not only recaptured by the enemy, it was actually burnt. So there was no bridge. And this is actually the sort of like the digital transformation symptoms that we see time and time again, that sort of long lead time to decision, that lack of sort of data-driven insight is actually leading to casualties on the battlefront, right? Obviously, Napoleon faced massive casualties during the battle, but in terms of our sort of casualties in digital transformation and data transformation, it becomes a matter of sunken cost, right? Building our platforms with long lead times, the platform is not used by the real users, it's not battle tested, and you end up spending millions, if not hundreds of millions, on sort of digital transformation and data transformation initiatives that are actually ineffective. Okay, so having that real-time data feedback, having that real-time foresight and predictions is vitally important. And this is something that I feel resonate with every CEO, this idea of the CEO missing out syndrome, right? They're looking out there, they're constantly thinking, you know, my IT teams is run the shop like a tight shop, right? We got costs down, we're delivering projects on time, right? We got capacity planning, but I'm missing out, you know, I'm really missing out on something. What are the other companies doing? And like Ryan said in the introduction is, well, you got all this data, right? You're moving house, you're kind of just packing it up and you're just moving along. You go, man, what do I do with the data? What a lot of CEOs fail to see is the fact that, well, you already have a gold mine, right? Don't worry about the GAFA, right? Don't worry about the Google, Facebook, Apples. You got data that they don't have, right? Or you might have metadata on your data that they do not have the context to, right? You got to tap into that gold mine of data that's sitting right behind you, rather than looking forward for other sort of alternatives and various other sort of tools that, oh, you know, I've got to do some blockchain. That's all important, right? Innovation initiatives are, you know, definitely part of the horizon growth of any organization, but it needs to be driven by the data. And you need to tap into the data that you already have and democratize that in a safe and compliant fashion to your troops on the ground, which is your employees and your data scientists, your business decision makers, so that they can then drive the innovation from the bottom up. And with this, I will throw over to you, Ryan. Is this something that you're seeing in the market and resonate with the US market that you see?
Yeah, I mean, just by the nature of my job, I'm out talking to a lot of executives in various different verticals and industries, right? And a lot of the time, there are questions. I mean, it's natural for us as humans to ask the question, well, how does Google look at data? It doesn't matter how Google looks at data. You don't run Google. You're not operating at that planetary scale, and you're not. That's not your business model. Your business model is you're a financial service organization. You're an insurance company. You have your own data. Let's instrument that data and let's leverage that. Rather than looking outwardly, let's look inwardly, right? One of the other things that I hear quite a bit from the executives are the whole idea of the business cases that have been built in the past 15 years or so on just the cloud migration, and they're not extracting the return that they're expecting to with the migration to the cloud. They're expecting to be faster, better, and cheaper. And really what they're doing is they're just reusing the cloud as the next data center in the sky, and they're not optimizing their systems, and they're not optimizing the way that they're looking at their data. If you're looking for a way to flip, again, the paradigm from technology projects being cost centers to technology projects becoming investment areas, data is one of the first areas that I would be looking at, because it's one thing that we're not short of, but it is also one thing that we do not leverage holistically across the, I was going to say the US region, but I think this is actually a global situation where we have all of this data and we just don't use it, right? Because we don't know what we have, we don't know how to use it, and we actually don't have the systems implemented to leverage it appropriately. But most organizations are now starting to hire those chief data officers, those chief digital officers, with the core remit of actually solving for that problem. So yeah, we see it all the time over here, Jan.
Yeah, interesting. And it's interesting you kind of mentioned that fact about the business case, right? To be able to validate the business case, well, you also need data, right? So it's kind of, the data itself can be a business case to sort of prove out, but then to then revalidate against a business case, you then need that sort of real-time data to also make those real-time decisions. So I guess kind of with sum up this section as, a lot of times the business value really requires that sort of exploration, right? That foresight. You don't know what you don't know, but you need to get out there. But to be able to do that effectively, you need to back it up by data and then constantly revalidate back. And all organizations, as Ryan has also validated, that across the world, everybody has a problem, and don't worry about the gaffers out there. They have a different risk appetite and a different compliance posture. Your organization is unique, your data, your employees, and your customers are your sort of unique competitive advantage that you can use and tap into right now. Okay, so now that we kind of elaborate on the why, but how do we actually do it? How does the cloud help, right? How does the cloud help you to do your data transformation? And I really like this quote from Andrew Ng, who's the leading sort of thought leader when it comes to AI and transformation, is that if you put Walmart and the internet together, that doesn't make Walmart an internet company, right? If you put any company with some sort of deep learning, a bit of machine learning, that doesn't make that company an AI company, right? Because it's that people and the culture aspect of an organization that truly drives an organization to be, say, an internet company or an AI company. Replace AI with data-driven as well, right? It's basically that culture. It really matters, and this is kind of what we also came to the conclusion of, and I would like to share with you today. And feel free to jot down any questions that you might have, or highlight any challenges that you feel that you're also facing. Is that first of all, does your organization have a vision to use the data to drive business value? So what we talked about in the why, the sort of CEO missing out syndrome, the sort of testing out the business value hypotheses and being able to feed it back. Is there such a strategy out there, right? If yes, then that's great. If no, then it's potentially something that you can drive from on the ground, speaking to your executives or kind of delegating down to your teams. But then when you kind of start on that first step, that's always the hardest bit. That challenge is always like where to start, right? And if you kind of already somewhere in the midst of the journey towards data transformation, how do you scale that out to the rest of the organization? See, these are the challenges that we always see when we talk to executives, is that they ask us, what, I just don't know where to start. I feel like I'm missing out. I got all this data somewhere. They're in silos somewhere in the organization. They're probably not secured and compliant either. But where do I start with that? And the executive who has started with the initiative is like, oh man, I'm doing this by myself, right? with my own budget. There's no backing from the top down. How do I scale it to the rest of the organization so that they get benefit like I do? And then we talk to clients, and then they tell us, oh, you know, we can't do this, right? We got compliance regulations, right? We just can't give the data, move the data to the cloud, or let our employees and business stakeholders access the data, right? We gotta lock it down. It's, you know, it's our job to keep the data secure and isolated so that no one can use it. Right? So we get that into that conversation a lot of times as well. And then there's the people and the culture. Is that, you know, all this advanced technology, you know, machine learning, data lakes, data ingestion, transformation pipeline, data warehousing, like our people and culture, they're just not ready. We're not a data-driven culture. Like, how do we actually enhance the culture of the organization so that everybody can think data-driven, so they can think about every decision we make, we back it up with the data. And one thing that you might see that in this slide is that out of all these three major pillars, it's not about the technology, right? It's actually about, you know, where do you actually strategically make a good place to start, and how do you scale? How do you actually deal with the democratization to your stakeholders while remain compliant within governance guardrails? And then how do you uplift the culture to be more data-driven in your organization? And I'll kind of double check with you again, Ryan. Does this resonate with you talking to the clients in the US?
Yeah, of course. And the ironic thing is, you talked about the compliance being a blocker for running data in the cloud, or for leveraging the cloud to democratize the data further. One thing that I'm seeing more and more is actually compliance being a use case for the cloud as a data warehouse, because if there's a means to actually better inform compliance and audit about how systems are being changed, managed, or monitored, or how users are interacting with systems, you know, that compliance posture and leveraging some type of data model to capture those data points creates a very simple pane of glass for an auditor to look at, or from the developer experience perspective. Hey, if I make this change in my inbounds or outbounds compliance posture, if we have data instrumentation on what those compliance rules are, it gives immediate feedback loops to either the developer or to the auditors. So what's interesting is a lot of this stalwart thinking of we can't do it because is actually being completely inverted. We need to do it because we want to remediate this heritage issue.
Indeed, yeah, thanks for that. It's actually, it kind of draws parallel to the sort of cloud adoption journey as well, is that by adopting the cloud, it actually gives you more rigor and more automation and more compliance compared to doing everything manually. And the same applies to data, right? It's actually because of compliance that it actually becomes the driver to actually be more data driven. Yep, thanks. Definitely, thanks for that. And wait, okay. So, you know, when we think about data, there's always this conversation around data is the new oil, right? That statement's been around for almost like 2 decades. But really, in reality, applied use of machine learning and artificial intelligence is actually the new electricity. So if you think about the oil powers the plant generates electricity, and it's getting to a point where it's almost mostly commoditized, right? You think about electricity, it's pretty much ubiquitous, right? You use it like tap water, right? You pretty much just switch it on and use it to your advantage. You shouldn't be building yourself an electricity generator to get electricity. And that's actually what's happening. What the cloud brings to you is that this ability to focus on the value proposition, the business value that we talked about, is that constantly testing it in real time against your customers, collecting more quality data, and then feeding it back to your value proposition in the form of models and predictions. So that the cloud really just allows you to really get rid of the heavy lifting because it's taken care of out of the box, so that you can focus on what, you know, would be unique to you as a virtuous cycle of innovation, or as Amazon would call it, the Amazon flywheel, right? So that constant reinvention, that constant feedback loop. And what this kind of really then gives you the advantage over your competitors who have, you know, unclaimed data, such as the little robot with a cleaner kind of broom, or your competitors who rely on hippos, right? Hippos as in highest paid person's opinion to make the decisions. It becomes a defendable sort of data moat that they cannot penetrate because you have the data. Not only you have the data, you're actually capturing and locking in your customers in a good way based on offering them the tailored and the sort of personalized value proposition that they need, which your competitors cannot do because they do not have this virtuous cycle of data innovation. So this is the kind of end state you want to get to, right? And then you think about, well, in terms of capabilities, the cloud offers you so much as out of the box in terms of all the toolings that you need to allow the business-facing division to really innovate, right? So don't worry too much about this diagram. It looks complex, it looks a bit overwhelming, but our advice to you is do not start trying to build the whole platform in day one, right? Because we've seen organizations take 3 years, and I think on average, the typical organization that I do talk to before we get in there, they tell us that, oh, you know what, my data strategy is 3 years. Sounds about right. But after 3 years, we also visit them up, like some of the organizations that have already been on this journey for 3 years, and they tell us, you know what, I really need your help because our business users are not using our data platform. I was like, oh, okay, so have you ever talked to the business users? So, like, instead of doing this, why not start with the actual business users themselves, right? Start with your use case, right? Start with that value proposition. Talk to your customers, collect the data, think about what use you have for the data. So it's a bit like there's a famous statement around almost data is a bit like garbage, right? But before you collect it, think about what you're gonna do with it, and then it becomes gold. So instead of building out the boil the ocean data platform, and this is also advice when it comes to cloud migration, instead of boiling the ocean with a massive cloud migration, pick one vertical, pick one really sort of lighthouse value-adding vertical across your data use cases that you can use to demonstrate to the rest of the organization the effectiveness of data and machine learning. And then you build out your platform as you go. You then add on the governance, the extra rigor as more divisions want to kind of come on board and use your data platform. And then you end up kind of organically scaling out your data capability and your platform. So instead of starting with a platform, start with a use case, and you end up with a platform due to organic usage. And then we'll talk about compliance, right? Okay, so as we are going along with our journey, we picked our use case, we picked our executive sponsors, we have the customers lined up to do testing with our sort of data-driven value proposition. But what about governance, right? What about the ITIL standards that we adhere to in the cloud and the application world? Implementing ITIL with DevOps and DevSecOps and SRE, service reliability engineering. So all the sort of frameworks can be met by practice and principles and automation. How does it work in the data world? Because I speak to companies and they're sort of like chief data officers or digital officers tell me that, we got a lot of really cool things going on, right? We got machine learning models, we got data lakes, but everybody's doing it by hand, right? Is that how you guys do things? Like, no way, right? Like, we do DevOps, we also do, we need to apply the same automation and rigor and compliance to data as we do in DevOps and DevSecOps. It's about applying data. No one should ever go into production and manually retrain a machine learning model or change a data ingestion pipeline by hand, right? I almost feel sometimes we are with data where we were 5-6 years ago when Contino was founded on the basis of measurable transformation for DevOps, right? Like, the data ops is very much in its infancy, and we're here to advocate for that, right? We must treat our data with the same sort of data-driven, the pipeline-driven approach. Infrastructure as code, but now we got analytics as code, right? We need to have that sort of same best practices that applies to DevOps world for data, and we also want to be meeting the industry best practices and frameworks around DAMA and DIMBOK, right, for data compliance through our automation. So we call that data ops in conjunction with data reliability engineering. So we make sure that data is accurate. We collaborate with our customers for shorter feedback loops, constant retraining of ML models in an automated fashion, not in a manual fashion. Data pipelines and analytics as code, and sort of data qualities and data lineage in place of what we would do in DevOps to measure everything, right? This concept is so foreign to even large multinationals that sometimes I talk to them, I say, you know, what about your data ops? What about your data engineering? Like I get blank looks, right? It's very much, what do you mean? We have data scientists, but it's actually the engineers that has to automate and put everything into pipelines and codification. So data compliance is not an excuse. It can be met through automation, and it will actually give you more rigor and more compliance as you adopt data ops and sort of the data reliability aspect of data transformation. And then let's look at the people aspects. Right? We talked about the toolings, the capability of using a lighthouse approach. We talked about the governance and compliance aspect. What about the people? So the operating model conversation applies to data as well. A lot of organizations start off on the left-hand side with bespoke projects where people just set up their own, you know, data warehouse, their own processes. And then what happens is the chief data officer will come along and say, no, we must have everything centralized. And over time, the centralization becomes too much of a sort of bottleneck, and then they will evolve towards a more sort of distributed, but within the centralized guardrails. So what we would call the data center of excellence, where distributed teams can be enabled by data with some sort of common schema or some common domain language and common data models, but they're also at the same time free to explore their own sort of data needs and initiatives within the centralized guardrail that's set by the chief data officer. So where you want to be, obviously, is on the right-hand side, but where you typically would start off with is on the left-hand side, right? So let's think about those challenges that we just talked about, the whole scaling of the capabilities. The idea is to start with the business-specific vertical and then scale out horizontally, right? We'll talk about how do you democratize your data to your stakeholders while remain compliant. It's about using automated governance through data ops and ML ops within best practice frameworks such as DIMBOK. We'll talk about how do we uplift the people and culture. It's by evolving in parallel a data operating model that suits the data maturity of your organization. So starting out with a sort of bespoke approach towards more centralized and that more sort of data center of excellence or data center of empowerment for your sort of multi-regional offices. And that's how the cloud can really help you accelerate your data transformation journey. All right. Let's talk now about the what. And I think, Ryan, you probably have a bit more context into how this would resonate with the US audience in terms of the US transportation system. And I'll hand this over to you.
Yeah, sure. So like I was saying in the kickoff here, the case study that we're talking about is for New South Wales, right? It's a transportation authority for a state in Australia. But what it is, it's a public transportation provider, right? So you can think of either Amtrak or an Amtrak Plus. So think of if your local public transportation authority, right? In Philly, we have SEPTA. In Atlanta, there's MARTA. San Francisco, there's BART. New York, it's the Metro, right? So they run the light rail, the regional rail, the buses, the ferries, the trolleys, the various different ways that public transportation works. Now, again, lifelong Philadelphia resident, I can't tell you how many times I could be going to a fantastic Eagles game and I'm taking the train or the subway, and there's just this surge of people, and you wonder, like, why the hell didn't they plan to put more trains on, or why are the routes running the way that they're running? It just makes no sense. Clearly, somebody should have thought of this, right? If you haven't experienced that, I think you probably need to get to more sporting events, concerts, or whatever it is, or even maybe it's just, you know, I live outside of the city, but I used to work in the city quite a bit, so I would take the train in every single day. And I don't know exactly what a switch is on a light rail track, but I do know that the frogs and the switches freeze up or they need maintenance. And for some reason, we don't find that out until things break, or if there's bad weather, it has an impact on schedules. So if you've ever felt any of those frustrations and you wondered why hasn't anyone thought of this before, It's because they did not have the access to the data, things like the weather data, things like the maintenance data, things like events and concerts and sporting sport games and things like that, where there's known data points that we're just not leveraging and aggregating to make better decisions based on our operations. So although we're going to be talking about New South Wales, what we should be thinking about is this is a use case where there is publicly available data that if we club that together with some of our known private data, how we can inform decisions better. And this is an actual Contino client that we did some significant work for. So with that, I'll let Jan kind of talk through how we positioned the problem, how we've centralized the problem and turned it into a business outcome for both the users and for the company itself.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That was an excellent introduction and kind of putting things in perspective. And remember, we said the approach to really scaling out a capability is to start with a business case. And this is actually the business problem that Ryan has just elaborated on, and I'll go into more details on the specifics. So to kind of give you a more of an overview of what transport for New South Wales does is that they are actually, in fact, the Uber and the PayPal of transport. Right? So not only they are a government body that owns all modes of transport for the state of New South Wales, they are so innovative that they have established what's called mobility as a service. So essentially like Uber, but for disabled folks and folks living out in the remote countries to be able to order public transport on demand. Right? So you think about, instead of Uber car arriving, you get a public transport van that arrives and picks you up because you live so far away that there isn't other modes of transport. So they're effectively actually taking that sort of very innovative Silicon Valley sort of approach to public transportation. And it's also interesting that they are becoming the PayPal of transportation as well, in that the smart card that's used, called the Opal card, is actually becoming a form of currency that you can use to actually pay for various things. So this is also something I wanted to ask you, Ryan. In Philly, is there a single sort of smart card that allows you to travel across all different modes? Is that a common phenomenon?
It actually is a thing in Philly. I know it's a thing in New York. It's a thing in Chicago, LA. It's pretty in Atlanta and San Fran as well. It's definitely becoming a thing, more readily available in the U.S. cities. But I can say outside of some of the bigger ones like New York and LA, up until 5 years ago, it was not something that was being leveraged.
Yeah, interesting. And it's also kind of worth highlighting that as a public organization that's there to serve the people of New South Wales, their entire strategy is actually not outsourced, crowdsourced from the actual people using the systems. So the community themselves actually drove the strategic initiatives of Transport New South Wales, such as establishing airspace for drones for delivery, having that mobility of service for the remote people who can't get public transport normally, and for actually focusing on women's safety at night, traveling alone on the transport networks. Right? So it's actually very much that customer-centric approach, allowing the customer to drive the strategy. So in terms of statistics, there's about 300,000 trips per day at peak on the Opal network. So the Opal network covers 5 different modes of transport across train, bus, ferry, light rail, which is trams, and the recent metro driverless trains, where the entire train system is controlled by AI and robotics. Transport in a strategic kind of initiative to give back to the community is actually open sourcing all of their data that is not private, that does not have private information. So they actually, obviously the data belongs to the people, so they give the data back to the people, right? And allow the people to build over 5,000 applications on mobile apps to be able to have better customer experience, right? So instead of trying to build everything themselves and holding on to data, they actually open source the data. And today they have over 6 billion API calls to their open data platform. And Contino has done some really remarkable work. You can read more about them in either the AWS case study or the Contino case study. What you see on the right-hand side is the real-time sort of executive dashboard. So this is only a part of the puzzle, but this was very much the executive sponsorship that was obtained through having an executive dashboard that led to the rest of the engagement, that sort of scaling model of data transformation. What you see at the top is a real-time view of how many sort of smart card taps and trips is happening currently. And then what you see at the bottom is a prediction of what will happen tomorrow, all on the palm of your hands, right? So the executive at any time or the minister in the government can really just take out their phone and actually look at a visual representation of what's happening across the entire state. So as you can see, the network is at the transport agency is actually quite advanced, and they actually collect a lot of data already. They're actually open sourcing the data, and they're very innovative. So what's the actual problem, right? It's kind of what Ryan kind of described as when you go to a sporting event and then you realize it's just a rush of people, right? Well, guess what? It's despite all the telemetry and all the data that transport we're collecting, because of the fact that there's 5 different modes of transport, all the numbers were very much focused on the transportation mode. So as in, is the ferry going to break down? Is the train going to break down? How many, how are the brakes on the train, and how are the buses actually running on time? They were all very much siloed, as you can see, right? The buses collected their own data, the trains collected their own data, and then the ferries collected their own data. And obviously the driverless trains had their own data as well. There was no consolidated view. So one day when it's raining, and interesting, Ryan talked about in Philly when it snows and it's icy and then the train stops. In Australia, in Sydney, when it rains, the train stops. Right? When it gets too hot, the train stops. We don't get snow, but it just so happens when it rains, the train stops, right? When it rains really hard. We get floods though, we do get flooded quite a lot. So one day when it was raining really hard, it was been raining for like 5 days in a row, and the transport minister, so he's actually very high up in the government, he basically asked the question, like, how many people are there on the network right now that are impacted? He couldn't get an answer. He had to wait 5 days for a paper report to be sent to him, right? 5 days later, right? By then it stopped raining. So the data is already irrelevant. It's a bit like Napoleon sending the order 5 days later, right? It missed the point. So the job got delegated to the innovation executive director, and Contino was involved to then think about what can we do to answer the question, right? How many people on the network across all 5 modes of transport? So we looked at what was needed. So instead of writing a single line of code or think about data platform and jump into data warehouse conversation, we actually interviewed the executives. We asked them, what do you need to really give you that sort of visualization at the high level, the aggregated view, right? And we came up with a prototype executive dashboard, working with the teams on the ground. And it's very interesting, the data silo, but so are the teams. The data science team do not talk to the cloud team do not talk to the executives. It's all about sort of bringing the silos together, to really break down the silos of data. And once we had a good idea, then we talked to the operation team. So these are the operation response team. These are the teams who actually are responsible to put on more trains, right? To put on more buses to replace the trains. And we interviewed them, and guess this, the news was very interesting. For them to actually realize how many people is on a station so that they can send replacement buses when the trains either break down or due to weather they couldn't run, they had to look at the CCTV cameras and count the number of people. Right? So one time there was about 40 people on the platform, they sent a couple of buses, but by the time the bus arrived, there was 4 people. So it was very not data driven. The data was definitely not real time, right? So kind of having the understanding that executives wanted an aggregated view, whereas the operation response team wanted that more granular station by station view. We looked at the data sources that we had, and we concluded that instead of looking at the train and the bus and the ferry data themselves, which are very much to do with maintenance of the vehicle, we can look at the Opal smart card data. That data will give us an aggregated view across all transport because everybody uses the Opal card to get on a ferry, to get on a train, to get on a bus. And based on that, once again, we didn't start with the platform. We started with actually building out the visualization so that the executives and the operation team can see for themselves what,
Hey, Jan.
what anything
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if it's on my end or if it's for everyone, but your audio got pretty excessively static. I'm not sure if you have a different mic you can switch to.
Oh, right. So you, okay, I can,
Ironically enough, we have static web as one of the application engineers.
is it still, no?
It's still spinning.
Okay.
I feel bad if it's only on my end, but I'm assuming it's hitting others as well. Yeah, so I'm getting told it's everyone's hearing the static. So what we can do is we can give Jan a couple minutes here, but effectively what Jan was explaining was that we drove into the idea of personas when it comes down to the or to the way that the data is being modeled for folks, and he talked through how operations and the executives had different areas that they cared about. One of the things that was obvious in the New South Wales space was the silos that existed, which is not unique, obviously. If you're on this, you probably know there are a great deal of silos in and out of the various different organizations that you're working in. So I'm going to let Jan come back on, see if his audio gets any better here to talk through the solution architecture that was put in place. So effectively what we're looking at here is when you look at the data engineers and the data scientists, they're getting data inputs from two different sources. You see the Opal card, which is again the single-use card that gives riders access to the various different modes of transportation. You're also getting information from the timetables, which is instrumentation of the trains themselves or the ferries, which are then going into a de-identified data lake. So it's a way for us to make sure that we're not tracing actual individuals, but it's a way for us to aggregate the data points in one area, which ultimately gets fed into Snowflake, which is it's a tool that is engineered and operates well for the cloud. It's cloud agnostic, so you can see it run on GCP, you can see it run on AWS, on Azure, whatever, what have you. This obvious solution architecture that we're looking at today, given that we're talking about Lambda, Dynamo, and things like that, is an AWS pointed solution. Once we have the Lambdas feeding into the data lake and into Snowflake, we actually have some BI that we can draw down from the Snowflake data warehouse. That then informs a Dynamo table, which ultimately then feeds out into the dashboards on the mobile devices for those personas.
All right. I think I'm back. I changed my mic. How's that?
No better, my friend.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. So let's do this. Let's pop forward a slide. So basically, one of the other questions, and I kind of talked about this with my my rendition of living here in the great state of Pennsylvania. Another question is, what happens when it rains tomorrow during a school holiday or during a Kylie Minogue concert, which is an actual use case that came up during our project with New South Wales. There was a Kylie Minogue concert, and it did put a surge or a rush onto the transportation system. Before this engagement, all of those questions would have been either unanswerable, or by the time we actually extracted those answers, it was useless. It was rendered useless because the event had already been realized and resolved, right? So if we can skip forward one, Jan. Really what we started to do then is start drawing in additional data points, right? So we talked about the aggregation of data informs the decisions that we're going to make as a business. Before, where we had the Opal and the timetables, lambdas feeding us data points, what we see now are actually weather and events. So we got data feeds that are giving us weather data and social event data, be that the schools, be that the concerts. With that, it's then going into the same data lake, into the same data warehouse, and ultimately it allows for us to forecast and model what changes in inputs are going to have as it affects riders and it affects system load and equipment impact, right? So ultimately what we then get is the ability to create some models. Those models can then be integrated with the APIs, and we can actually start prognosticating how the system is going to behave to these environmental changes.
How's my sound now?
Perfect, buddy.
Oh, awesome! Thank you, Ryan. That was an excellent walkthrough. I couldn't have said it any better myself. And I think one thing to take away from this approach is that it started out as a very sort of specific use case, but then it scaled into machine learning, and then obviously it's also scaling across the rest of the transportation organization at the moment. But it really validates our point about starting small and specific on a particular business outcome, get the buy-in, and then scale out to the more advanced functionalities such as machine learning and model training. So if we quickly just recap on what Ryan has just highlighted, is start out with a very minimum platform. Don't start with a massive horizontal platform. The basic that you need for data ingestion, data lake, data warehousing. The executive visualization was the key to get to the next phase, which was to do experiment predictions using SageMaker, continuous model training, and the more detailed granular operational dashboards. And now transport is very much hit the orbit, right? They are continuously innovating on new innovation initiatives, such as figuring out the travel patterns of occupants, look at root cause and anomaly detection. So if the trains do stop, why is that, right? And then what can we do? What's the prescribed action? How many replacement buses or how many replacement trains? How many additional trains should we increase, to maintain the same level of customer service? And I think the outcome of this entire engagement over 3 months was the ability to give the executives as well as the transport minister a 5-minute near the real-time view of the data, right, instead of 5 days. And the reason for 5 minutes is actually because of the downstream data system, not because of the data platform itself, because the data will come in batches of 5 minutes. And also 80% accuracy in terms of prediction over the 24 hours ahead. And everything is serverless, as Ryan has pointed out, which means that as a government organization with a very tight budget, they can scale up and down and scale back when nobody's using the system. Okay, so testimonies from both the direct sponsor as well as the executive sponsor is that the technology really half the time that it takes for the data science team to build the prediction models, and that the solution does meet the needs of that real-time prediction and visualization across the network. And what I'll quickly just run you through is a demo as of now. Because it is midnight in Sydney, there are in real time 2,855 users, right? And this actually ticks if you watch closely every 5 minutes. So there's various sort of executive statistics that they can show to other executives to say, what's going on my network, what's going on your network. And what you see here is really the actual, which is in red, against the prediction, which is in the yellow line. And you can't really see the yellow line because the actuals and the predictions are pretty close, right? And what you see in the dark sort of blue is actually what happened last week. So obviously we're using the past data to extrapolate into the future predictions. And for the operation folks, or even for the executive at a high level, they can look at the sort of prediction for tomorrow, given the sort of public holiday events, concerts, and the weather as well. So, and this is actually like a glimpse of the more granular view that the operation folks will get in a more granular dashboard that's kind of available at a very high level in the exec dashboard as well, at a per station level. Okay.
I think if you step back and you think about this, like obviously we're talking about a transportation authority use case. But this, the data points and the actual presentation layer here may not specifically be ported over to, say, a bank or a telco or an insurance company or something like that. But if you think about it, like if you think about the science behind the visualization, there is direct correlation. If we can look at things like market behavior, if we can look at things like the housing market and interest rates in that space, how is that going to inform the way that users are going to be looking for loans or loan processing or staffing for just call center operations or anything like the number of new iPhones purchased or things like that. How's that going to impact my my network as a telco, right? While this is a very pointed use case, there are very simple correlations that we can make leveraging known data that is either available to us privately or available to us publicly.
Yeah, and you also think about where transport started is that they collected a lot of data on the vehicles, but not on the people sort of traveling behavior, and everything was done from scratch, right, within a 3-month period. So think about what this can do for your organization, this approach and this methodology, given the availability of high-level services from cloud, such as AWS and Snowflake, that you can instantly just pick out of the box, right, to actually accomplish your needs. Going back. Yep. So let's kind of recap on our original value proposition. Is that the purpose of the cloud-based data transformation approach is to democratize your data to drive real-time value while remain controlled and compliant. And if there's one thing that you take away today, is this statement, and focusing on the emphasis of democratization, real-time value, and controlled and compliant. With that, I'll hand over to Ryan to summarize the key takeaways.
Yeah, and we'll do this quickly because I appreciate that we're actually over time. But really, the one thing that every company that I talk to has is data. And how can we actually take that data and turn that into a business value driver, right? So capitalize on our existing data. Make sure that we're not looking, we're not walking around with a hammer and everything looks like a nail. We should be commoditizing the data platforms and AI services and using them for what they are, which is a means to an end, to leverage our data to drive more value quickly. We spent some time today talking about data ops. Actually, it's kind of the foundation for this entire webinar. But what data ops is and how you get there is probably a multi-webinar journey in itself, right? So shifting from either a traditional org or an org that's starting to embrace DevOps and CloudOps into data ops is contextual, but it's something that there is no prescribed run book to get from A to B on that. You need to understand your organizational strategy, your organizational competencies, and honestly, where the value lives within your org. And that obviously informs your data operating models and how that interplays with your existing operating models and strategies. The one thing that cannot be said loud enough, this is what we do at Contino. This is what we do for fun, to be fair. We just happen to build a business around it. The folks that we have are exceptionally passionate about solving these exact types of problems. As you can see from the very brief overview of what we did for New South Wales, we have existing IP that accelerates and leverages prior art to quickly bring these things to value with our customers. We operate in very small batches. Typically, our projects are 2, 3, 4 months, and we bring something to the customer that's valuable in those times. So if any of this is interesting, if this is something that you guys are looking for in your business, please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to have that conversation, Yun or myself directly, or anyone in the Contino network. And with that, I think we come to a close. The next webinar that we will be doing is on migrating critical applications to GCP. We did this for a customer over in Europe. We got critical apps up and running in GCP, all from code in 8 weeks. So how can you draw down learnings from that to bring to your bring to your organization. We have other future webinars coming up, so those are available on the Contino website or on our social media feeds. So hopefully this was valuable. Jan, it's always a pleasure to be with you, my friend, but thank you for everyone that logged in or is watching this later.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and apologies for the technical difficulties. If there's any questions, please just feel free to reach out to us directly, and looking forward to hearing from you.